now we cross over to our Oh Soo-young for a global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thank you. It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. Now, amid high tensions over Ukraine, officials of the United States and Russia wrapped up their first round of crisis talks after 7 hours on Monday. Late last year, Russia began militarizing along its border with Ukraine and spelled out demands for changes to the regional security order, including stopping NATO's expansion eastward. There's been great uncertainty as well over the last few days over how the West should respond to Mr. Putin's demands, and Monday's meeting has ended with no breakthrough, according to US media. Also, there's been uncertainty over how the recent riots in Kazakhstan that the Russian military stepped in to intervene will affect the regional dynamics. With further meetings between Russia and NATO countries scheduled in Geneva this week, we discussed today how the talks might proceed. For this, we connect with Ambassador William Courtney, an adjunct senior fellow at RAND Corporation. He was the United States ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia and has also served as the US-Soviet Nuclear Testing Commission. Very warm welcome to you, Ambassador. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And well, first of all, Ambassador, we really want to hear your reaction to the US-Russia talks that was held in Geneva on Monday. They spoke for almost 8 hours, didn't they? But why didn't they have any outcomes?
The demands that Russia has made are so sweeping, if you will, virtually outlandish, that no one really expected much progress. The United States did offer to discuss medium-range missiles, limits on those, and confidence-building measures that could affect the size or transparency of military exercises. Most of those issues go back to previous treaties, Soviet treaties and Russian treaties that were negotiated many years ago. Unfortunately, the Soviets, Russians violated the INF, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the U.S. withdrew from that. So there is possibility to go back and make some progress there, but there's no possibility of NATO ending its open door policy or of NATO removing military infrastructure from its new members, which the Russians have demanded.
And of course, the Russians have demanded some sort of security guarantee. What is the significance of a security guarantee being discussed by the two sides?
There is no real discussion of a security guarantee. The West is not in a position to offer a security guarantee. NATO itself involves security guarantees among the members, but a guarantee to Russia that NATO will never expand into Ukraine, for example, the Ukraine or Georgia would never become a member, would be contrary to longstanding NATO policy. I'm not sure why the Russians pushed this issue this time this hard. It's possible that Russia is concerned now that Ukraine has moved so far and so fast to Europe that civil society in Belarus wants to do the same thing. That Russia is concerned that Ukraine and Belarus, which are the two other East Slavic societies beyond Russia, that both of them may drift away from Russia and toward Europe. And I think that's the larger concern the Kremlin has.
And also, well, with the riots having taken place in Kazakhstan, there's been a lot of questions surrounding how Mr. Putin is going to react to this and how that might affect his approach to Ukraine. What is your view on this?
Putin was probably as surprised as anyone else that the sudden popular uprising occurred when it did over a fuel price issue in Western Ukraine in an area where workers are not paid well. It spread like wildfire, and these kinds of things happened before. For example, in 2018, a pension reform protest in Russia spread like wildfire. Well, this probably caused some concern in the capital of Kazakhstan because it wasn't clear if security forces would be totally loyal to the regime. There's been a lot of concern among Kazakhstanis about the stupendous wealth of the Nazarbayev family. And there's been concern about the renaming of the capital of the city after Nazarbayev. There's been small-scale unrest for a couple of years now, but nothing like this.
And it was quite shocking to see the Russian troops intervening really into Kazakhstan and with their president having called for help. And while the Kazakh president said that Russian troops are now set to go home in a couple of days because he says that the riot situation has largely stabilized with the troops having carried out these cleanup operations. There was a state of emergency and a nationwide curfew were put in place, and there were also reports of internet blackouts and media control. And well, although the Kazakh president claims that the situation is under control, is that really the end of the matter, do you think?
Probably not. We're going to have to wait and see to what extent popular uprisings, which have spread across the country, will continue. With regard to the Russian troops, I think the real reason they're going home early is President Tokayev's inviting them in was very unpopular in Kazakhstan. There are a lot of nationalists in Russia who would like the northern regions of Kazakhstan to be annexed by Russia into Russia. So bringing in Russian troops is anathema to most Kazakhs. I think President Tokayev realized his mistake, and the Russians also don't want to create a situation in which Russian troops are shooting ethnic Kazakhs, because that would alienate Kazakhstan from Russia even greater. And up till now, Russia and Kazakhstan have had good relations, and the West has encouraged that.
Well, Kazakhstan, of course, was the last of the former Soviet Union states to declare independence in 1991, just a year before you were deployed there as the US ambassador. How do you assess the current power relations between Kazakhstan and Russia?
Russia has not worried so much about Kazakhstan as it has about Ukraine and Belarus. Ukraine and Belarus border on the European Union. They are Europeans, countries, European peoples, and have been more pulled by the liberal and more prosperous lifestyles in Europe. That has not been so much of an issue in Kazakhstan, so they have maintained good relations. All the trade, transportation routes from Kazakhstan to the outside world go through Russia for the most part. Kazakhstan is the largest landlocked country in the world. I think in the future, whatever government comes to power in Kazakhstan, they will try to maintain good relations with Russia.
And well, the Kazakh president, Kasim Tokayev, he turned to the Kremlin for help, of course, with the recent riots. And well, Mr. Tokayev said this week that Russia isn't going to stand for any revolutions in Kazakhstan. What do you make of this sort of comment that he made?
Well, President Putin has been against what are called color revolutions, of the kind that took place in Georgia and Ukraine, for example. He's been against those ever since they started. And when the Arab Spring came along, that increased concern in the Kremlin even more. The pension reform protests in 2018 in Russia, I think, threw a scare into the Kremlin. But the Kremlin really does not have the ability to prevent popular uprisings from emerging. So it will probably want to be careful in dealing with Kazakhstan, and the Kazakhstani leaders will also want to be careful in dealing with Russia. An additional factor is China. China is investing a lot of money in the Belt and Road Initiative, transportation routes through Kazakhstan, other kinds of investments. So Kazakhstan has to balance Russia, which has primarily political and security interests in Central Asia, and thus far China, which has primarily economic interests. So partly because of those two giant neighbors, Kazakhstan wants reasonably good relations with the West, with Europe, and with the United States. Probably a future government that comes to power in Kazakhstan is going to want to maintain that balance, what Kazakhstanis call multi-vector policy, and that is something that the West supports.
Oh, well, Mr. Putin has insinuated that the West was involved in the recent riots in Kazakhstan, and well, namely the United States. What do you make of these claims?
Oh, they're totally false. It's a standard Kremlin charge about everything that happens that is contrary to what the Kremlin favors. This is genuine popular uprising. These were striking workers who were protesting a doubling of the liquefied petroleum gas price, which they rely on for heating and for their cars. But the underlying conditions have been stupendous corruption and wealth by the ruling family, the Nazarbayev family. an enormous amount of money has been spent on a new capital, Astana, now called Nur-Sultan, and that has taken money away from other regions of Kazakhstan and taken money away from the working class of Kazakhstan. I think those underlying conditions are the main explanatory factors behind the current unrest.
And well, you mentioned Kazakhstan balancing relations with China, the US and Russia, and well, the US and Russia, of course, the United States, of course, has been very wary of China's growing military force and its weapons capabilities, particularly in recent months. And there's been a growing sense of urgency over arms control talks with the absence of the INF Treaty, which you, in the past, pointed out that the Russians had violated, and of course, this increasingly aggressive China. So at this point, what do you think could be achievable between Washington and Moscow in terms of arms control talks? And what kind of progress are you hoping to see in terms of engaging China in those talks as well?
So President Biden, as soon as he came into office, extended the New START treaty, which deals with long-range strategic weapons, nuclear weapons. And that has been extended for 5 years. So there's a little breathing room to negotiate. But what we're seeing from China now is that China traditionally has had what strategists call a minimum deterrence policy. China has not tried to match the numbers of nuclear weapons and nuclear delivery systems that Russia or the United States have had. But that's changed. Now China is embarked on a major nuclear modernization program. There's speculation in the West that China is abandoning the minimum deterrence policy and wants to come up somewhere in rough equality, perhaps with Russia and the United States. So this makes it more important for China to be involved in the next long-range strategic nuclear weapons negotiation. The United States has discussed this. Russia is kind of standing to the side, if you will, but I think the United States, Russia, and China in the end are probably going to have to come together in some kind of a negotiation.
Well, to be honest, many see Russia as a power that's in its twilight years, and it's perhaps trying to stay relevant by sparking these sort of provocations and making demands towards the West. What is your view? What do you think Mr. Putin really wants from the West?
So Mr. Putin wants a sphere of influence. He wants the ability to maintain a coercive sphere of influence, primarily with the republics that were former Soviet republics in his area, right around Russia, and especially the East Slavic countries, Belarus and Ukraine. The West, since World War II, the whole concept of coercive spheres of influence is something that the West and the international community generally have opposed. And other countries don't have that sort of thing. Russia and the Kremlin have, they're still back more in a 19th century mindset in terms of foreign policy and thinking that coercive spheres of influence are possible. I think as time goes on, we're going to see that the independence of the former Soviet republics, all of which in the last 30 years have maintained their sovereignty and independence, that there's going to be more respect for that in the future. But for the time being, Russia is probably pushing too hard, particularly against Ukraine. Russia's taking a chance by threatening to invade Ukraine now. And if it were to do that, the devastating financial consequences of sanctions could really harm the Russian economy. So I think the Kremlin is probably thinking twice about whether that might be a smart move.
And while the Russians have a list, they seem to know exactly what they want out of these talks. But the question is, does the US and European nations know what they want? How do you hope to see them approach negotiations in the coming weeks, especially with the NATO officials on Wednesday in Brussels meeting, with officials from NATO meeting their Russian counterparts later this week?
So the West has a pretty good concept of what it wants, and these are, as we discussed before, limits on medium range or intermediate range missiles in Europe, as well as confidence and security building measures to increase transparency around military exercises and reduce risks for those things. And again, those are issues that the Soviet Union and Russia have negotiated for many years, and we had agreements in those areas. Some of the confidence-building agreements are still in place. Russia, though, has come to the table with really demands that are just pie in the sky, just beyond what can be achieved. So this is unusual. Russia knows how to do serious negotiations. In the strategic arms negotiations and the Iran nuclear agreement, Russia didn't issue demands that were totally unacceptable at the beginning of the talks. Rather, Russia approached those as serious negotiations. So it's a bit puzzling to the West why Russia has suddenly, at this point, come out with demands that it knows cannot be reached. So Russia's risking some humiliation, if you will, by proposing such demands, and then it's probably going to have to accept some, let's say, more modest achievements that are going to raise questions in the minds of some people why Russia behaved that way.
Well, I'm afraid this is where we'll have to wrap up the interview today. That was Ambassador William Courtney, Adjunct Senior Fellow at RAND Corporation and former US Ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia. Thank you very much, sir, for your time today.
You're quite welcome.